but you can run in here if you have questions for the speaker afterwards. So before we get going, the usual administrative announcements. If you have devices that buzz or vibrate or ring, now might be a good time to put those in silent mode. I will follow my own advice here. If you're taking the course associated with the brown bag, the sign-up sheet is over here. So please just make sure you sign that before you leave today. And also be sure to clean up your mess as you leave here and throw away all trash so that we don't have to, because we don't like doing that. Next week's speaker will be William Pike from Pacific Northwest National Labs. I did get it wrong last time. Thanks, Alex, for correcting me. But today, we are very fortunate to have one of our own, Maithilee Kunda. I think many of you know. She's a research scientist here at Georgia Tech in interactive computing that works in artificial intelligence and cognitive systems. Prior to coming to Georgia Tech, originally as a student, she graduated from MIT. She was also named an Anita Borg Memorial Scholar by Google, and in 2010, especially appropriate for the GVU crowd, she was named as one of our Foley Scholars. So, so we're really fortunate to have her here tell us about her work. Let's welcome Maithilee.
Thank you, Keith, very much for that nice introduction. All right, can you guys hear me well? Thank you very much for coming to hear about my research today. So I will be talking to you guys about visual thinking in the data to action pipeline. And first, I will explain what I mean by that. So many of you have probably seen an infographic like this showing the evolution of data storage over the last 100 years or so. But a graphic you probably haven't seen is this, showing the evolution of the human brain over the same time scale. Sort of the key observation here is that our data storage capacity has increased by a factor of about 10 to the 15, whereas the increase in brain size is only about 10 to the minus 2. This raises a very important question, which is, given that we basically have the same cognitive resources that we've had for the last 100 years, how can we deal with this explosion in the amount of data that we have to somehow understand and take action on? So this is a common sort of model of this pipeline, saying, we start with data, somehow we have to create knowledge from that data, and we can use that knowledge to take action. My research really focuses on this middle step, the knowledge part. And in particular, if you talk about creating knowledge from data, there's sort of two steps. One is, there's a lot of technological approaches now in creating new kinds of data models and new visualizations. But also, those models and visualizations at some point have to be translated into mental models that people are actually carrying around in their heads. And those mental models are really what drive the actions that we eventually take. To sort of summarize this point, I believe that understanding human cognition is a critical step in this pipeline of data to knowledge to action. So my research, this is my vision. Most of my work revolves around developing computational models of visual thinking with two main goals. First, I want to create new AI techniques for reasoning about information in intelligent ways. And second, I want to use these techniques to inform new interactive technologies that leverage what we know about human thinking to create better user experiences. Applications of this work are pretty broad. So there's a lot of work right now looking at the role of visual attention and visual search in advertising. Also, the field of visual analytics, how can we develop ways to simultaneously model and present data to humans? And my work in particular looks a lot at education and assessment, and in particular, education in developmental conditions such as autism. So, what do I mean when I say visual thinking? Simply, it's the use of visual mental representations for tasks other than perception. So here are a couple of examples of what I mean by that. So this is a very famous cognitive task developed in the 1970s called mental rotation. Basically, I can show you this top image and say which of these bottom shapes represents the same shape as the top image. So the idea here is that you're using visual mental representations. You're creating a mental image of this first object and doing mental transformations on this to answer this question. Here's another example. If you subtract image B from image A, what does the resulting image look like? So most of you could look at this and form a mental image of what the answer would be. So both of these tasks are examples of using mental representations for something other than perception. You're actually reasoning using mental images. So this view of reasoning is in contrast to the use of propositional or verbal mental representations. So here's what I mean by that. So a very conventional view from artificial intelligence constructs this kind of pipeline. So you get some inputs from the world into a perceptual system. This perceptual system converts these inputs into some kind of propositional representations. And then you can reason over these representations to create new knowledge and action. So there are many, many AI systems in the world that could be described using this kind of pipeline. And so here's an example. You take some visual percept, say, and you can construct propositional representations like symbols that represent that image. You can measure attributes of the image. Oftentimes, this can include quantitative information. And you can also have structured knowledge representations that describe the inputs from the world in some way. So all of these, there's very, very rich ways to describe the world using propositional representations. However, a better view of intelligence might be that there's actually a dual process pipeline. So we have this propositional pipeline that we've seen through many examples of AI systems is very effective. But we can also think about, perception doesn't have to translate inputs into propositional representations. What if perception keeps some of that in visual form? And we can actually reason using those visual representations as well. So the mental rotation is one example of that pipeline taking place. So my work really focuses on the top part of this pipeline. If we talk about going from perception to reasoning to action using purely visual representations, what kinds of tasks can we solve and what kinds of performance can we get? So here's a brief outline of my talk. I'll talk first about some work that I did on, that focuses on reasoning using visual representations. The second part of my talk will focus on more recent work that I've been doing with attention, and I'll close with some acknowledgments and future directions. So what is the relationship between visual thinking and intelligence? There are many examples from human history in which people have described the power of visual thinking. So I just picked 3 examples to share with you here. So first, James Clerk Maxwell discovered the field equations of electromagnetism. So our own Nancy Nersessian, who was a professor here till recently, looked at, so Nancy did cognitive analyses of Maxwell's work, in which she looked at his notes and papers to try to figure out how he made the discoveries that he did. And what she found in her work was that there's evidence that he actually did use visual mental models to drive some of the discoveries that he made. Temple Grandin is a woman who was diagnosed with autism as a child. She's now a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University. Temple Grandin has talked extensively about how she feels that she's a visual thinker. She says that she thinks in pictures. And she talks about how this has given her advantages in some areas, but disadvantages in others. So for example, she designs livestock equipment. And it's estimated that over half of the livestock in this country go through equipment that she's in some way designed or worked on. And she has kind of a really remarkable ability to look at a facility or a piece of equipment, and she says she's able to visualize how it's working in great detail, and that's what helps her really see the issues and see how to fix the problems. But on the flip side, she also talks about how because she thinks so visually, she has trouble sometimes with understanding abstract concepts or with communicating with the people around her. This final example, does anybody know who Jonas van Essen is? He's a recent superstar in the World Memory Championships. So he memorized over 30 decks of playing cards in 1 hour. Among other things. So the interesting thing about Jonas van Essen is that he did not start out sort of being a visual thinker. Most of the world memory champions these days practice deliberately techniques for memorizing large amounts of information. And almost universally, these techniques are visual. So they memorize a landscape that they walk through, and then as they're memorizing things, they place the items that they're memorizing in this landscape, and then when it's time to recall, they just walk through their landscape again and kind of see all of the elements that are lying around. So it's very interesting, and so there's evidence now that any of us can become sort of superstar memorizers by practicing some of these techniques. And they are visual techniques. So here we have really interesting examples of scientific discovery, engineering design, and just sort of sheer cognitive performance, all through visual thinking. So even though we have all of these great examples, cognitive science has not given us a very good computational understanding of how these things work. And so that's really one of my goals. So in my work, I've looked mainly at this particular task, which is called the Raven's progressive matrices. So this is an IQ test that was developed in the 1920s by a man named John Raven. And it's actually currently one of the best single intelligence assessments that we have. So this is a pretty simple example of the kind of problem that you'll see on this test. So that you see a matrix of figures with one missing entry, and then your job is to choose the answer that best fits. So this one answer is pretty easy. Here's one that's a little bit more difficult. I'll give you guys a moment to study this. Anyone want to say what they think the answer is? I'm hearing 4 quite a bit, and yes, that is correct. Yeah, the answer is 4. So I look at the Raven's progressive matrices test as a task domain to ask this question, what can visual thinking give you on this test? So in the psychometric literature, literature that looks at intelligence tests of this kind, people do generally agree that humans use both visual and verbal or propositional types of reasoning on this test. So there's been neuroimaging studies that show different parts of the brain being activated for different problems, and kind of lots of evidence that there are 2 processes happening here. However, it's interesting that most of this literature assumes that only the very easy problems are solved visually. And once you get to hard problems, like the one we just saw, people assume that you have to use propositional representations on these kinds of problems. So the question that I asked in my research is it actually possible to solve the Raven's test using purely visual representations? And previous AI systems have been built to address this test, but they all reason about problems propositionally. So I'll next talk about the system that I built to try to answer this question. So I built a computational model that I call the ASTI model that basically tries to answer these kinds of analogy problems using purely visual representations and reasoning. So this is kind of a high-level description of the model. I'll go through each of these steps in sequence. So the first thing the model does when looking at one of these Raven's problems is it has to decide how can I construct analogies from all of these different elements that are occurring in the problem. And this also should be done visually, for the model to be sort of a fully visual model. So the way the model does this is basically it just looks at parallel sets of rows or columns in each matrix. So for a 2 by 2 matrix, so one where there's 2 rows and 2 columns, the kinds of analogies you can construct are pretty obvious. You can look at the rows or you can look at the columns. For 3 by 3 matrices with 3 rows and 3 columns, it's a little bit more complex. So again, you can look at rows and columns, but you can also look at diagonals. And you can see that the model kind of extends the same pattern of elements to complete these diagonal sets. But you can also, in a 3 by 3 matrix, look at pairs of elements in the same patterns. And so this is an illustration of the analogies that the model builds. More formally, the model is basically defining an analogy in these problems using sets of collinear entries. So let's take all of the collinear sets of 2 or 3 elements, and then I can construct analogies using pairs of these, where there's a source set and a target set. The source set doesn't have the blank entry, the target set does, and we want those to be parallel. And those 3 constraints are enough to construct all of the analogies that you saw on the previous page. So that's how the model defines analogies. The second step is to take those analogies and try to look at the source sets and induce what kind of transform best explains what's going on here. So the model has in memory a set of visual transformations. So the model in particular has 8 rotation and reflection operations and 3 operations that have to do with combining sets of, with combining images. So using these 11 transformations and combinations of them, the model tries to decide how can I explain what's happening in a given row or column. So for the first example problem that I showed you earlier, so the model will first look at the first row here, this pair of elements, and it'll say, if I take all of the transforms that I have in memory, which of these best explains the change that's happening across the top row? So and the way it does this is it basically just takes the first image and transforms it according to each of its transformations in memory, and then it compares that to the second image and calculates a similarity score. So for this particular example, you can see that the rotate 180 flip operation appears to generate a good match with the highest similarity score in this list. So more formally, basically the way the model works is it's defining a similarity measure between a transformed version of the first image and a second image. And the way it's calculating similarity is using the Jacquard coefficient, basically a pixel overlap measure. How many pixels are in the intersection of these 2 images divided by how many pixels are in the union. And then the model chooses the best fit transform just by picking the which transform generates the maximum similarity score. So that's kind of a simple description. In practice, what we actually ended up doing with the model is instead of choosing a transform based on one row or column, it chooses the transform that best explains the difference across all rows or all columns, which ended up giving us a little bit better performance. So that's how the model induces a transform over some of the elements in the matrix. And then once you have this transform, so once you know that this top row can be explained by essentially a horizontal reflection, how can we get to the answer? So what the model does is it basically takes this and then applies that best fit transform to the target part of our image analogy, which in this case was this bottom incomplete row. And then it'll take the first element in that row and apply the same transformation to that element to generate a prediction of the answer in the form of a new image. So the prediction is just the max similarity transform from the previous step applied to the empty row or column. So then we get a predicted answer in the form of a new image. And finally, it's a pretty straightforward last step. The model just compares its predicted answer to all of the available answer choices using the same similarity metric and chooses the answer with the highest similarity. So that's the four-step process of how the model solves a given matrix problem. And again, note, so all of the reasoning is done using visual operations over purely visual representations. And also, in our work, in this piece of research, we used raw unmodified scans from a paper copy of the test booklet. So you may have noticed that some of these similarity scores weren't as high as you might have expected. It's because these images are noisy. So this original test, this test booklet that we're using, it's been modified a bit over time, but it was originally published in the 30s. So this was probably done on a drafting table with ink. So it's, we're not talking about having pixel level accuracy in the way the images match up. So we were using raw scans from this test. I will next talk about the results that we got with our model. So first, to orient you a little bit to what this test looks like, so this is showing results on the SPM, which stands for the Standard Progressive Matrices version of this test. So this is sort of the most widely used version of the Ravens test. It has 60 problems, and the score is just given as the number of problems you answer correctly. So on the y-axis here, you see 0 to 60, so it's showing number of problems correct. And these lines are showing the human norms for children and adolescents in the United States. So if you look at the 50th percentile line, an average 8-year-old will score about 20, a little over 25 on the test. Average 18-year-old will be getting in the mid to high 50s. So that gives you some background for what these different scores mean in terms of human performance. So when we tested our model on the SPM, the model gets a score of 50 out of 60 correct, which is about the level of an average 16 to 17-year-old. So we thought this was very interesting, because if you remember earlier, I told you that sort of the conventional views of the Ravens test was that visual strategies are only used on the very easy problems. Our model is showing kind of an interesting possibility, which is that even if you're limited to using visual strategies, you can still answer quite a few of the very hard problems on the test. You can get a score of 50 out of 60, so the level of a 16 to 17-year-old. And so we are currently doing quite a bit of follow-on work to sort of look at these results in more detail. So I'll just briefly talk about three of these directions. So the first is that one limitation of the current model is that it only does the transformation induction in one pass. So it can only use one transformation to try to explain what's going on in one of these problems. If you look at a problem like this, which comes from a different analogy test, you'll see that there's sort of multiple elements in this problem and different things going on. And it sure would be nice to be able to say, well, this triangle, the rectangle moves over and the dot disappears, and kind of deal with it in a step-by-step way. So what we're doing is some work on, what if you can sort of take multiple passes at this problem and store the results in visual working memory at each step. And so what this enhancement to the model does is it basically says, let me take one pass with the algorithm that I showed you previously and see how many of the pixels I can explain. And then I'll set those aside and do another pass. So it takes an iterative approach to solving these kinds of problems. And you can see on this problem, it sort of successfully segments out the triangle and then the rectangle. And then there's a little bit of noise here again. We're using sort of raw images here that aren't cleaned up. So with this, this is actually one of the mechanisms that we think may account for some of the remaining performance. So those 10 problems that the model didn't get, we suspect may have been because some of the problems are like this. So they have multiple things going on. So this is one extension of our work. Another piece of research that came out of this work that I want to call out is my good friend and colleague, Keith McGregor. Is Keith here? No. Okay. Keith started working with me on this work about a year after I had started. And he he had experience previously in working with fractal image representations. So fractal representations are just another way to represent images that rely on the observation that real-world images show self-similarity at multiple scales. And what we realized is that the same transformations that are used in the ASTI model, the rotation, reflection, similarity, can be used to compute these fractal image representations. So Keith used these representations to look at solving Raven's test problems and also a couple of other visual cognitive tasks, extending this work on how far can you get using purely visual representations. More recently, Keith's work has been extended by Teska Fitzgerald and Andrea Tomas to look at, can we use these kinds of visual representations to support imitation learning in robots? So it's very exciting to me to see this research moving forward. The final direction that I wanted to call out is that these Ravens problems, so I've been talking to you a lot today about solving things in different ways. The key idea here is that the modality of representation matters. When you're building an AI system, you don't have to use propositional representations. You actually have lots of different options that may be suited to different problems and show different patterns of behavior. My PhD advisor, Ashok Goel, and another colleague, David Joyner, took these Ravens problems and turned them into a series of projects for the knowledge-based AI class here at Georgia Tech. Has anybody here taken this class? So a couple of you. It's a great class. I highly recommend. And it's they've been using the Ravens test as a framework for class projects. And they've recently expanded this into the OMS version, the OMS offering of KBAI. And I think we've currently had over 650 students complete these projects with another couple of hundred working on them every semester. So I will now move on to the second part of my talk. So moving on from talking about reasoning and the Ravens test, and I'll now talk about some more recent projects that have to do with the role of visual memory in attention. So, this is a famous example of the sort of interesting findings you can get when you start looking at visual attention. So look at these two advertisements and think about which one you think is more effective. Which of these is more likely to make you want to run out and buy yourself some Sunsilk shampoo? Who thinks the one on the left? This one. All right. Who thinks the one on the right? Who doesn't use shampoo at all? So we can look at this and make hypotheses and predictions about what people might be thinking. Left is right. So another way to answer this question is to use eye tracking. So let's actually look at the patterns of people's gaze when they look at these two different pictures. And when you look at that, this is actually what you see. So in fact, it turns out, if you voted for the right one, you are correct. In the left one, where the girl is looking right at you, people tend to look right back at her. And nobody's even looking at the Sunsilk brand at all. But when she's looking at Sunsilk, you're like, ooh, what is she looking at? So gaze following, it turns out, is a really fundamental part of human gaze behaviors. So this is an example of how looking at visual attention can give us a much more nuanced view of this combination of perception and reasoning and taking action on what happens. So the next project I'll talk to you about is looking at visual attention, and more specifically the role of visual memory in search. And so this work was done in collaboration with two great students here. I don't know if they're here. Nope. So Julia Ting and Sai Rashid. And we were asking the question, if we are trying to understand, how visual attention works, what is the role specifically of visual working memory? So we carry some visual representations in our minds. How do those affect the patterns of visual attention that we show? And for this project, we were looking at another neuropsychological assessment called the embedded figures test. Again, a very widely used test that's sort of used to understand people's cognitive abilities in a range of situations. So here's an example. I'll show you an example of the embedded figures test problems. So the idea is you see some search environment that looks like this, and in a minute I'm going to show you a search target. And then your job is to find the search target somewhere in the search environment. So here, and I'll show you the environment again too. So here's the environment that you're searching in. Here's the target. So see if you can find it. This one is pretty simple, right? It's just right there in the middle. Here's another example. It's a bit tougher. Here's your target. Let's see if you can find where it is. So has anyone found it yet? Yeah. So a few of you. I'll give you guys another 10 seconds to keep looking. So my student Sai actually came up with this example problem, and even after I knew the answer, there were times when I would be working on one of our papers and I was staring and I couldn't find it. I had to email him and ask him where is this again? So it actually is in there. It's right there. Yeah. So there was an interesting observation. So this is another test that was developed a few decades ago by a man named Herman Witkin in 1950. And Witkin made a very interesting observation about this task in his original paper. He said, when people are solving this, they seem to pick some part of the search template, the target, to focus on. And then they find just that little part somewhere in the search environment first, and then they sort of trace around. So did anyone feel like you did it that way? There's actually a lot of different ways to do it, so it might not be everyone. And so this was an observation that Witkin made. We basically looked at this observation and realized that there was an interesting question to ask here. So search, generally speaking, is all about allocating limited cognitive resources to solve a problem. And there's been lots of work on modeling search, including a lot of computational AI models. And usually people are looking at limited resources in terms of, you have a limited focal area, you have a limited spatial memory to remember where you've searched previously. So we wanted to ask the question, what happens when you're storing some search template in memory and you have limited access to that search template? We developed a model to explore this question, which we call the imagery-based search model. And again, this is kind of a high-level outline, but I'll go through these steps in sequence. So first, the model is storing a visual representation, so essentially an image of the search target in memory. But because we said we want to look at what happens if you can't actually access the entire search template at the same time, you can only access it in pieces. And so this makes it, this might be simple enough for most people to remember in one shot, but you can imagine having some very complicated search template that you can't actually just call to mind all at once. So the model divides this search template into pieces, and then it uses one of those pieces as its anchor feature. So like Witkin's observation, let's just pick one of these and use it to anchor our search in the search environment. So here's an example where the model has chosen the sort of top part of this little house as its anchor feature. And so instead of searching using the whole shape, it's only searching on its first step, it's only searching for this little top part. So you can see it's found several examples of where this occurs in the search environment. So then once it's found those, it'll trace around the outline of each one. So it performs a random walk across these search hits. And then at each point, it will trace around the rest of the features until it finally finds the figure that it's looking for. So I'll show you some results from this. So on the example problem that I showed you earlier, depending on, so what this graph is showing on the y-axis is the number of simulated fixations. So how many spots in the search environment does the model have to check? How many places does it have to look before it has successfully completed the search? On the y-axis, we're showing the number of fixations as a function of which feature the model is choosing as its anchor feature. We ran each of these. So because the model is performing a random walk as part of its search, it's non-deterministic. And so we ran each one 10 times to get a measure of variation across runs. And so these error bars are just showing the standard error. And what you can see is that depending on the choice of anchor feature, the model actually shows quite different performance. So to sort of understand what these results mean in the context of this task, it's important to know what this task is actually intended to measure. So when Witkin developed this test, he said this embedded figures task is a measure of field independence. And this was a term that basically means freedom from sort of distractibility of things around you. The ability, so field independence is the ability to concentrate on one thing and sort of pull it out from a distracting background. So you can see how, on a problem like this, if you can, the more quickly you can solve this kind of problem, in Witkin's view, the higher field independence you showed. So interestingly, what our results are showing is that this choice of anchor feature actually has a huge effect on the performance that an individual would show. And so there's a couple of possibilities here. So we've shown that anchor feature matters, but if you look at an intelligent system like a human solving this, what role does this actually play? So one possibility is that maybe we all just pick anchor features at random. Then it's not so interesting. But another possibility is that we actually choose the anchor feature in some systematic way. And in particular, if you remember, I actually showed you this picture first before I showed you the search target. You guys remember that? So this is actually a very specific part of the instructions in giving the embedded figure test, is that the subject is supposed to see the search environment first before you see the search target. Witkin is very specific about that. In fact, if you do it the other way around, the sort of field independence effects disappear completely. And so we have sort of a hypothesis based on our results here, that maybe when you look at this environment, that actually is somehow priming you to pick a particular anchor feature over another. So first, if you think about what makes for a good search here, you might be tempted to say, oh, I want to pick the anchor feature that's the most unique feature of my search template. But in fact, under this model, the best strategy is to pick the anchor feature that's the most unique feature in the search environment. So if I show you the search environment first, that actually makes it in a way, could be priming you to, in fact, do the opposite, to pick the feature that's the most common in the search environment that you just saw. So our hypothesis here is that, in fact, our account might actually be giving a set of computational mechanisms that can explain part of what Witkin meant by field independence. Because basically, if you look at this and you are not primed by what you see to choose a particular feature, then you will do better on the test. Going beyond this example problem, I can show you results on the test as a whole. So we ran our model against all 18 problems on the embedded figures test. What we see here, so these bars are basically showing, again, across 10 different runs of the model. This graph is showing the min, mean, and max of number of fixations for each problem. And so you can see, again, kind of following the pattern of the example problem, there's a lot of variability here, almost an order of magnitude on some problems in the performance that you get. So what this work is really, sort of the final observation that I leave with you from this work is that if you pay attention to visual working memory as a key component of these models of visual search, then there are highly non-trivial effects that come out of the way you're strategically handling visual working memory. So then I'll move on to the next, the sort of last piece of research that I'll talk about, again looking at visual attention. And this piece of research is looking at another cognitive task that's called block design. So block design, one of the most widely used IQ tests is called the Wechsler scales. There's versions for children and adults, and they've been used for decades. This block design task is one subtest within these IQ tests. And block design is also said to be one of the best indicators for detecting various types of brain damage. So neuropsychologists will give this task to someone and look at very specific patterns of performance and be able to say, like, it seems likely that you're showing this cognitive deficit for this neurological reason. So this is an example of what, just kind of a simple illustration of what the task looks like. You're given a design and a set of blocks. So these are actually like literal wooden blocks, and every block is identical and has these 6 sides on it. And then your job is to arrange the blocks to recreate the pattern that you see. So this task is interesting from the perspective of memory and attention, because if you notice, it combines attention and memory and action in kind of an interesting way. So first, when the participant is looking at the design, so there's, that's the attention part. I'm sort of attending to this, and then I have to actually store some part of that design in memory while I go to the blocks to pick up the block that I want. And then I'm acting using that. So I'm acting using the contents of memory by placing a block here, and then you kind of repeat this loop in order to solve this problem. And so the question that we're asking here is, if we sort of systematically vary the strategies that we use to allocate attention and the strategies that we use to store and access things in memory, how does that affect the overall performance that someone would show on this task? So this task is interesting because, sort of computationally, any of us could probably, like all of you undergraduate CS students could probably sit down and write a model to solve this task pretty quickly. But what's interesting when you look at humans is that there's a lot of variability in human performance. So different people, when a person will sit down and solve this, different people will show very, very different strategies in solving the test, and that's part of what makes it such a good indicator as a cognitive assessment. So these are also the undergraduate students who helped me on this project, and they also showed great variability in the strategies that they used to solve this. And so what we have been doing is doing a human study to sort of get very detailed measures of performance on this task. So we use a ceiling-mounted camera to capture the exact sequence of actions that someone takes when solving one of these problems. We also use a wearable eye tracker to capture shifts of attention while someone is solving this. And to give you a quick illustration of the power of wearable cameras in doing this kind of research, if you look at these 2 images, this is actually Yin, who's sitting over there. Yin, you're famous now. So Yin is solving one of these problems. And you can see that as a third-person observer, he looks almost exactly the same. It's very hard to tell where he is looking just from third-person observation. But he's using the outputs from this wearable camera, you can actually see very clearly when he's looking at the design versus when he's looking at the blocks. So I think we're just now getting to where these wearable cameras are sort of common enough to use in a wide variety of research settings like this. So I'm really excited to see where this sort of wider field of research goes in the future. So we're definitely really excited about this. So in addition to capturing these detailed measures of human behavior, we're also building computational models that essentially explore how different strategies will generate different patterns of behavior. And so the goal of this, so far we've done this with adult participants. In the future, I'd like to expand this to look at children, typically developing children of different ages, to look at developmental changes, and also children who have experienced atypical development. And the high-level goal is to see, can we construct populations of models that capture the same kinds of variability that we see in humans, and then eventually build bridges to help explain why different groups of people show certain characteristic patterns over others. So that wraps up the projects that I was talking about today. Quickly, some acknowledgments. So I've had many great collaborators and colleagues at Georgia Tech in the School of Interactive Computing and Psychology, and also at the University of Montreal and the University of Quebec at Montreal. So just wanted to recognize these folks, and also many thanks to sources of funding for this work. And finally, I'll close with just a quick outline of future directions for this work. So the 3 different projects that I talked about today, transformation induction with the Ravens test, imagery-based search with embedded figures, and the attention memory action loop with block design, all come together under this umbrella of looking at computational frameworks for visual thinking and using those to explain and predict aspects of human behavior. One area that this work is hopefully going in the area of AI is to really look at how far we can push the bounds of this kind of visual thinking. And in particular, I sort of have a vision of trying to see, can we actually make a visual AI that can solve all of a standard IQ test? So this would be tough, but we'll see how it goes. Also in the area of visual analytics, can we use these kinds of models to better understand how people are interacting with and consuming different kinds of information visualizations? And finally, I mentioned my work in education and assessment. So I've showed you models of these various tasks that are actually, so all of these tasks are used very widely in diagnosis and assessment for a lot of different populations. So I'd like to see if we can use this computational level understanding of these tasks to get more nuanced explanations of why people show certain performance on these tasks. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much, and I'll open it up for questions. Yes, Jim.
Have either the visual or the propositional models been used with the Shepard-Metzler mental rotation test that you showed early on?
I have not, with my model, done that. I think there have been, in fact, and now I'm forgetting his name, there was a professor in, is Saurabh here? So one of my other undergrads was working with a professor in BME here who was actually working on that exact problem, yeah. So it is happening, in fact, here at this very university, yeah. Yes, question?
Part of the process was inducing the next step, right?
Yes.
The level of inductive reasoning involved. I'm curious to know, like, is the model looking into non-inductive tasks that doesn't have like an inductive step in it, that is non-inductive in any way?
So the question was, is the model, so the model has this inductive step, that's really the heart of the model. Is the model looking at any non-inductive tasks? So I think that, So the second 2 tasks that I showed you maybe are examples of that, because they're really using a lot of the same mechanisms, so the same kinds of rotation and search and similarity transformations. So in that way, yes. Like I think I think that the sort of core contribution of this family of models is the idea of using things like visual similarity, rotation, translation as fundamental reasoning operations. Essentially, these are your reasoning primitives. Instead of having, adding and subtracting and list making, let's use these as the computational primitives and, write intelligent programs using these. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, question.
So is that sort of the boundary between visual thinking and propositional thinking? I really don't understand, like, what part of, for example, like the formation of analogies is not part of proposition.
Okay, good question, good question. And so this is actually a really deep question. And in cognitive science, there was actually, for decades, there was what was called the great imagery debate, when people were really trying to wrestle with this question of, like, what does it mean to have a visual representation? Do humans really have these? So to answer part of your question, yes, it's possible to do most of these operations in a propositional way. So, like, you could solve the same problems using the same kinds of high-level strategies, using propositional representations instead. And so I think one of the core questions here is, to what extent does that equivalence actually hold? So visual representations, there's lots of different ways to define them. In my work, I define them as a representation that has the key property that there's some isomorphism between the structure of the representation and the structure of what it represents. So in other words, I'm representing a triangle as pixels arranged in a triangle and not as just the word triangle, right? And so, of course, you could imagine trying to solve these problems by converting to propositional representations and then solving them that way. But it's an open question, how far we can actually push just the visual representations alone. And I think the reason that's interesting is because in humans, there's evidence that we do this, right? There's evidence that we use our visual cortex for things other than just visual perception. So that area of the brain is active even in sort of reasoning type tasks. And so that's really what I'm going for. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, question?
I'm curious about, I don't know technically what this would be called, but something like the heart problem in AI or something like that, which is, to what extent do you think that the way that people are actually solving these tasks is similar to the way that you're modeling? Or, and maybe a different way of asking is, like, so if a lot of what you're doing, it seems like, is you identify these possible transformations and you kind of do a brute search through them, right? Is that the actual challenge for humans when they're doing these tasks, or is part of what people are doing that that differentiates people who score well on these tests and people who score worse is something about how you reduce the search space, or which transformations you choose to apply in which order, or identifying the possible subset of transformations. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first of all, yes, yeah, you're correct. So the model that I presented here is the Ravens model, is not intended to be sort of a realistic model of human cognition, because as you observed, it's using brute force search, so there's no heuristics, and so clearly humans aren't sitting here and running through all all the possibilities. So this model was really intended to be a proof by existence that this was possible. So two things I'll mention to answer your question. One is that we are looking at how we can compare this to human behavior, given that we're not actually modeling. So we're not modeling things like reaction time very well. However, one thing that we are looking at is, does this model provide an explanation of error patterns in humans, in different groups of people? So if you remember, these are all multiple choice questions. So if you make a mistake, presumably you're making that mistake for some reason. Like, you really thought this was the answer because of the strategy you were using. So one thing that we're looking at actually is, are the errors made by our model more or less similar to the errors made by different groups of people? And in particular, going back to the connection between autism autism and visual thinking, we're looking at the errors made by our model compared to people with autism versus typically developing people. So that's sort of ongoing work that we're still looking at. So the other part of your question is, what is this test actually testing in people? Like, what's the important thing? And interestingly, there's some, at this point, it's just sort of speculation in the literature. But it's interesting on the Ravens test that so many different computational models have been built. So there's the model I built. Keith built a different model. There was all those previous models that I mentioned that use propositional representation. So it looks like there's a lot of different ways to solve some of these problems. So one idea is that maybe sort of the reason the Ravens is such a good test is actually because there's so many strategies available, and maybe what it's really testing is how well you are able to pick a strategy for the problem that you're on in real time. So maybe it's sort of, at a metacognitive level, maybe this is really a test about strategy selection. So another kind of future direction of our work is, can we, sort of glom a bunch of these models together and then develop some kind of strategy selector that can, in real time, sort of pick, which strategy is appropriate for a given problem. Great question. Yeah. One more question?
Somewhat related to that. So you train this using a tool which helps to diagnose neurological damage. Do you think that this kind of modeling could be used as a therapy device for people who have suffered that sort of thing? A kind of cognitive tutor to help train them on how to go about these tasks?
Oh, interesting question. So the question is, I've kind of talked about this in the context of diagnosis and assessment. Could these models play a role in therapies for individuals with brain damage or individuals with atypical developmental conditions? That is a really good question, and I hope so. So I haven't directly done any work in that area yet. I think one of the main benefits of these models is that they provide sort of concrete end-to-end explanations of why a particular neurological deficit might generate a particular behavior. If you think about having this model, and I can say, well, if I tweak this part of the model, then I see this result in behavior. So that's a very nice explanation. And so I think the power of this model for therapy will really be in being able to individualize those explanations. So if I assess someone using these kinds of tests, and I am able to develop a really detailed understanding. So I don't have to, in order to understand their behavior, I don't have to compare them to 1,000 other people. I can just compare them to this model and say this is a possible explanation of why they're showing this behavior. Then I think that yes, it would be possible to use these to develop much more targeted interventions and therapies.
That's great. I think we're just about out of time, so thank you.
Thank you very much.